I don't need you to perform, I just need someone to sing. There's a difference. The woman who said it was the events coordinator at Maplewood Community Center, a kind and practical woman named Odette Frayne, who had been organizing local memorials and gatherings for 22 years and understood, better than most, what people needed in rooms full of grief. She was on the phone, and the person she was speaking to was Calloway Finch, who was 25 years old and had been singing at funerals, memorial services, and community halls for 4 years, and who had heard the word perform used in relation to her voice so many times in so many dismissive contexts that Odette's careful distinction landed with a quiet force she hadn't expected. "I understand," Calloway said. "I'll be there." She hung up and sat for a moment at the small desk in her childhood bedroom, the bedroom she still occupied in her father's house on Dunmore Street, where the bookshelves were his and the houseplants were her grandmother's, and the whole place smelled on most mornings like coffee and old paper and the particular warmth of a home that has been lived in by careful people for a long time. She looked at the window. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing the thing it did in October, falling at an angle that made ordinary things look significant, that made the maple in the yard look like it was lit from the inside. She had trained for this, not for the funerals specifically, not for the community halls and the mostly empty theaters and the charity events where the audience was distracted and the sound system was always slightly wrong. She had trained for music as a serious practice. 4 years of formal study at Crestfield Conservatory, where she had been told by 2 different instructors that her voice had a quality they struggled to name, a quality that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with something underneath technique, something you either had or you didn't. She had graduated with distinction. She had spent the following year sending recordings to agencies and venues and labels, attending auditions in good clothes with her best prepared pieces, sitting in waiting rooms and then in offices across tables with people who listened with the expression of someone solving a problem, and then told her, in various careful phrasings, that her style was not what the market was looking for. Too classical, too folk, too emotional in a way that didn't have a clear commercial category. Too honest, one man had actually said, and then corrected himself, but she had heard it and filed it away. She had not argued. She had thanked them and left, and driven home, and sat in the kitchen with her grandmother, Vera Finch, who was 73 and made knitted scarves and small handmade crafts that she sold cheaply at the community market or gave away to whoever seemed to need warmth, and who had looked at Calloway across the kitchen table that evening and said, "Your voice is not meant for crowds, it is meant for hearts. Those are not the same audience, and the second one is the more important one." Calloway had held that sentence for a long time after. Her father, Emmett Finch, was a literature professor at Crestfield University. He was gentle and thoughtful in the way of people who have spent their lives in close proximity to language and have developed, through that proximity, a particular care about how things are said. He had raised Calloway and her brother Silas largely alone since their mother, Diane, had died when Calloway was 14. Diane, who had been a social worker, who had spent her professional life advocating for vulnerable families, and who had taken Calloway along to community events from the time she was small, who had said to her daughter more than once, with the simple conviction of someone who meant it completely, "If you have a gift, use it where people need it most." Calloway had been trying to do that. She thought about her mother at the beginning of every event, the way you touch a compass before a long walk. She had been singing at funerals since she was 21. The first time, she had been asked by a family friend whose sister had died, who had heard Calloway sing once at a university event and had called her in some desperation 2 days before the service. Calloway had said yes immediately.
She had stood at the front of a small church on a gray January morning and sung for 40 people who were sitting with the particular weight of fresh grief, and she had felt, in the quality of silence that followed the first verse, something she had not felt in any audition room, a sense of complete and reciprocal attention, a feeling that the music had somewhere real to go, that it was landing in people rather than being evaluated by them. She had driven home afterward with a feeling she couldn't name precisely, but that she recognized as right. She had sung at funerals and memorial gatherings and small community events for 4 years now. She was not paid well. Sometimes she was paid in the form of a meal and a hand held for a long time by someone who could not find the words for what her singing had given them, which she privately counted as more than money. Her name had spread quietly through the community networks that coordinate grief, the hospice volunteers, the bereavement support groups, the community center coordinators like Odette Frayne, who knew who to call when a room full of people needed something that wasn't a speech. She was not famous, she was known in the way that genuinely useful things are known, not broadly, but deeply, by the people who needed her.
Her grandmother had started recording short clips of her performances on the small tablet Emmett had given her for her birthday, and sometimes Vera would show these to neighbors or family friends with the proprietary pride of a woman who understood she was showing people something real. Calloway had asked her, gently, to be thoughtful about sharing them. Vera had agreed with the particular agreement of someone who intends to continue doing what they're doing. The October memorial was held at Maplewood Community Center on a Thursday evening. It was a gathering to mark the second anniversary of an accident on Route 14 that had taken 3 lives in a single moment, an event that had moved through the small community like a stone through still water, leaving circles that were still spreading. The families of the deceased gathered every year on this date, not in the formal structure of a service, but in the quieter, less prescribed way of people who simply need to be in the same room with others who understand the specific shape of what they're carrying. Calloway arrived early and set up without ceremony. She never used elaborate arrangements, just a microphone on a stand and the space to stand in front of it. Odette showed her the room, which was filling slowly with people who moved carefully, the way people move in rooms dedicated to grief, with a consideration for others that ordinary social gatherings rarely produce. She saw him near the back. He was sitting in the last row, a 4-year-old girl pressed close against his side, his hand around her small shoulders. He was 34, with the particular appearance of a man who had once been someone who took up space in a room and had decided, at some point in the last 2 years, to take up as little as possible. His name was Jarrett Kane. He had lost his wife, his mother, and his father in the Route 14 accident. He and his daughter, Wren, had been at home that day. Wren had been sick, a minor fever, and he had stayed behind while the others went to pick up supplies for Wren's birthday party, which had been 3 days away. He had received the call at 4:17 in the afternoon, and he had been receiving versions of it internally every day since. He had come tonight because Wren had asked to come. She had been told, in the careful, truthful way he tried to tell her things, that this was an evening to remember Mama and Grandma and Grandpa, and she had said she wanted to go, with the simple directness of a 4-year-old for whom the logic of honoring people you love needed no further explanation. He had not wanted to come. He came for her. He had not spoken to anyone since arriving. He sat in the last row and watched the room and held Wren's hand and waited for it to be over.
Calloway began at 7:15. She started with something quiet, a folk arrangement she had developed slowly over 2 years from a melody her mother had hummed in the kitchen that she had transcribed from memory and built into something with words, something about the persistence of love past the boundaries of presence. She did not announce it. She did not introduce herself or the song. She simply began, and the room, which had been holding a low hum of careful conversation, went still. Wren looked up immediately. She had been sitting with her head against her father's arm, and she lifted it when the singing started and turned toward the sound with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a child who has identified something important. The first song ended. Calloway moved into the second without pause, something older, a piece she had learned from a recording her grandmother kept, a song about leaving and being left, and the particular way certain people remain in the fabric of a place even after they're gone. Two people in the front rows were already holding each other. Odette, standing near the side wall, had her hand pressed flat against her sternum. It was the third song that did it. She had written it herself 6 months earlier, after sitting with a recently widowed man at a hospice event and listening for an hour to him describe his wife, not the death, but the life, the accumulation of specific ordinary things that had made a person irreplaceable. She had gone home and written a song about ordinary things, about a coat left on a chair, about the way a person's handwriting on a grocery list becomes, afterward, something almost unbearable to look at, about the particular quality of missing someone who was so woven into the texture of your daily life that their absence doesn't feel like a hole, but like a change in the air, a difference in how everything feels. When she sang the second verse, she heard a sound from the back of the room. It was not loud. It was the small, compressed sound of a person who has been holding something for a very long time and has encountered, without warning, something that reaches through their defenses, not violently, but gently, the way water reaches through, not forcing, but finding. Jarrett Kane was crying. His hand was over his mouth, and his shoulders were moving, and Wren had turned to him and put both her arms around his waist with the instinctive, unhesitating love of a child who knows exactly what her father needs, even when she cannot name it. Calloway saw it. She kept singing. She did not look away from him, and she did not look at him in a way that made him feel observed. She simply held the room with her voice and let the song do what she had written it to do. What she did not know was that the double doors at the back of Maplewood Community Center had drifted open at some point during the third song. The evening was mild for October, and the doors had been propped earlier for ventilation, and the sound of her voice had been moving out into the street the way sound moves from an open door, not broadcast, not amplified, just present, just available, just there for whoever was passing. People had stopped. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that genuine things draw attention without asking for it. A woman walking her dog who had slowed her pace and then stopped entirely, standing on the sidewalk with her head tilted. Two teenagers who had been on their phones and had separately, without looking at each other, put them away. An older man who had been locking the flower shop across the street and had paused with his keys in his hand and not moved. A delivery driver who had parked to check an address and had not gotten back in the vehicle. A small, quiet gathering had formed on the sidewalk outside the open doors of Maplewood Community Center, and they were standing in the October evening, listening to a voice they did not know, sing about ordinary things that nobody had put into words quite like this before.
Some of them were crying, not because they knew the people the memorial was for, but because the song had found something in them that was not about Route 14 or those specific 3 lives. Something more general, something that most people carry in a place they don't examine too closely, about the people they have lost or might lose or are in the slow daily process of loving with the particular helplessness of knowing that love and loss are the same continuous fact. The song ended. The silence was complete. Then it broke, not into applause exactly, but into the particular sound of people breathing again, of people releasing things they had been holding, of a room and a sidewalk returning from somewhere they had been taken. Odette stood at the side of the room with tears on her face, looking at the back of the hall where the doors were open and the small gathering on the sidewalk was visible in the lamplight.
Among the people standing on that sidewalk was a man named Gideon Marsh, who was 46 and ran a small independent music label focused on what he privately called honest music, folk, classical crossover, work that prioritized emotional truth over commercial formula. He had been walking back from a dinner 2 blocks over and had stopped outside the Maplewood Community Center at the beginning of the 3rd song and had not moved for 9 minutes. He had his phone in his hand. He had not recorded anything. He stood and listened with his full attention in a way he had not done in years. And when the silence came after the song ended, he stood in it and felt certain of something he could not have explained if asked to be precise about it. He did not go inside. He looked at the community center sign, noted the name of the venue, and walked on. He would find out who the singer was. It was simply a matter of the right inquiry to the right people, and Odette Frayn's name was not difficult to find. After the gathering ended and people had moved slowly into the quiet conversations that follow these events, Jarrett Kane sat in the last row for a long time after others had left. Wren had fallen asleep against his arm, her breathing the slow, complete breathing of a sleeping child, her face peaceful. He sat and looked at the front of the room where Calloway was quietly packing her things, and eventually he stood, carefully so as not to wake Wren, lifting her against his shoulder, and walked to the front. Calloway looked up. "I'm Jarrett," he said. His voice was the voice of someone who has not spoken much and finds the mechanism slightly unfamiliar. "The accident 2 years ago, my wife and my parents." "I know. I'm so sorry." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My wife, I remembered something tonight while you were singing. She heard you once, years ago, at a charity event. I think you were maybe 20, 21. She came home and told me about a singer she had heard, and she said—" She stopped. His jaw tightened slightly and then released. "She said, 'One day this woman will be famous. Her voice feels honest.' She didn't remember your name. I didn't either until tonight when Odette introduced you." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know if that means anything to you."
Calloway stood very still. The room was nearly empty now, the chairs in their rows, the evening settling. She thought about her mother. She thought about use it where people need it most. She thought about 6 years of funerals and empty halls and rejected auditions and her grandmother's knitted scarves given away to people who needed warmth, and a song she had written 6 months ago about a coat on a chair and a grocery list in someone's handwriting, and a man crying quietly in a last row while his daughter held on. "It means everything," she said. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man for whom words are not sufficient and who has learned to live in that insufficiency. He shifted Wren gently on his shoulder. Then, "Thank you for singing, for staying in the room with us." "Thank you for coming," she said, "both of you." He walked to the door. At the threshold, he turned back briefly. "She was right," he said, "about your voice." He left. Calloway stood alone in the empty room for a long time after. The chairs, the microphone stand, the open doors at the back where a small gathering had stood in the evening and wept for strangers, the October air coming through, cool and clean. She thought about a woman she had never met who had heard her sing when she was 20 years old and had gone home and told her husband, "That voice feels honest." She thought about how some things travel through time in ways you cannot track, how a sentence said in a kitchen becomes a compass, how a song written in a quiet hour finds the exact ear it was meant for, how kindness sent forward without a return address still arrives eventually exactly where it was needed. She did not know about Gideon Marsh yet.
She would learn the following week when Odette forwarded her a message he had sent through the community center inquiry form, brief, specific, asking if Calloway would be willing to speak with him about recording a small collection of her original work. She would respond carefully and without urgency, because she had learned not to attach her sense of rightness to outcomes she couldn't control. The conversation would lead to a recording. The recording would find its audience gradually, the way honest things find their audience, not in a rush, but in the accumulating way of something that genuinely resonates. She would not become famous in the way the audition rooms had been imagining when they rejected her. She would become known, which was different, and in every way that mattered more. Hospitals would call her, hospices, community organizations working with grief and trauma and the quiet emergencies that don't make the news. Gideon would release 3 recordings over 4 years, each one finding more ears than the last, each one reviewed in the language of people who are trying to describe something that exceeds their vocabulary for music and have to reach for words like honest and necessary and felt.
Ren Kane began taking simple music lessons from Calloway in the spring following the October memorial. Jarrett drove her every Saturday morning to Calloway's parents' house on Dunmore Street, and he would sometimes sit in Emmett's kitchen while his daughter learned to find notes on a small keyboard, and Emmett would make coffee and they would talk in the unhurried way of 2 people who did not require each other to be anything other than what they were. Vera would bring in knitted things she was working on and sit at the table, and the kitchen would have the quality of a place where people come to be gently restored. Jarrett did not recover from his grief in the way the word recovery implies. He did not arrive at a destination where it no longer existed. He rebuilt his relationship with living in the slow, imperfect way that real things are rebuilt, through accumulated ordinary mornings that asked only that he be present in them. Ren, at 5, told Calloway one Saturday morning that she wanted to sing at her school's winter show. Calloway had looked at this small, serious girl with her father's steady eyes and said, "What do you want to sing?" Ren had thought carefully. "Something that feels like home," she said. Calloway had taught her a simple folk melody that Calloway's own mother had hummed in their kitchen, and the circle of it, the way things passed between people across years and losses through the medium of something as elemental and irreducible as a melody, had not been lost on either of the adults in the room. 4 years after the October memorial, Calloway performed on a proper stage for the first time, not a concert hall, but a 1,200-seat theater that a regional arts foundation had organized around the theme of music and community healing, a well-attended and widely publicized event with several performers across different disciplines. She was the closing act. She stood at the microphone in front of 1,200 people, which was the largest audience she had ever faced, and she felt the same thing she had felt in that small church on a gray January morning when she was 21, the quality of genuine attention, the sense of the music having somewhere real to go. Before she sang, she said, "For many years I sang for empty rooms and grieving hearts. I sang at funerals and in community halls and in hospital corridors where the audience was sometimes one person who needed a hand held. Those people were my real audience. They always will be." She paused, and the theater was very quiet. "My mother used to say, if you have a gift, use it where people need it most. I've been trying to do that. I'm still trying." In the front row, Jarrett Kane sat with Ren on one side and Emmett Finch on the other, and Vera was next to Emmett with a knitted scarf in her lap that she had brought for no particular reason except that her hands were always making something for someone. Jarrett was not crying. He had his arm around Ren's shoulders, and he was watching the stage, and he was, for the first time in a very long time, simply present. Not enduring the moment, but inhabiting it, which is a different and harder and better thing. Ren leaned up and whispered something in his ear. He bent down to hear it. Then he smiled, slow and real and completely his own. He had not smiled like that in 4 years. Calloway began to sing. Outside, through the lobby doors that had been propped open for the arriving late guests, the October evening was doing what October evenings do, falling in long, angled light that made ordinary things look significant, lit from the inside. And if any stranger had been passing on the sidewalk and had heard the voice coming from the theater, they might have stopped. They might have stood in the lamplight without knowing why, feeling something they could not name, something that had no category except true. Some voices are not meant to fill stadiums. They are meant for the quieter emergency, the room full of grief, the last row, the man with his hand over his mouth, the child holding on. They are meant to reach through defenses not by force, but by honesty, the way water moves through, not by breaking, but by finding. And the people who carry those voices, who carry them through years of empty halls and rejected auditions and rooms that did not know yet what they needed, those people are not failures waiting to be discovered. They are already exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly what they were made to do in the rooms that needed them most. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything.
If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating and sharing meaningful stories of kindness, resilience, and hope with a wider audience. We would truly appreciate hearing your thoughts, so please feel free to leave a comment and share your perspective.